Hello, this is Module 4 lecture. In this lecture, we're going to talk about Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. So in Chapter 6, we start to look at more of the thinking and the feeling part behind substance use. We're going to talk a little bit more about, stages of development, things that happen, substance use across the lifespan, and stuff like that. The textbook starts off by introducing Erik Erikson's stages of development. There are 8 stages in this, process. The 8 stages of development is what it's called. I'm not going to go over each one with you because I feel that you can kind of review that or look through that by reading the textbook. But something important to note is that, you're going to start at that first stage. But in order to move on to the second stage, you have to complete a set of tasks. Or as Erikson references, there are crises that you have to overcome before you can move to that next stage. So each stage is going to have a different set of tasks in order for you to complete before you can move on to the next stage. So his theory was that this is how we learn to cope with change because, we go through these tasks or we go through these crises, we learn how to adapt to them, we learn how to make the changes, and then we move on. Something to put into perspective with that is if we're going through these life stages and then you add substance use into the mix, that complicates things a little bit because these life stages are being resolved by the use of substances, not by you actually completing the task or completing the crisis. So what happens is this stage or this crisis is actually not being resolved. You're not overcoming that stage. And a person gets stuck. So they're not able to kind of move or transition on to that next stage. So just something interesting to kind of put that into perspective as far as how these 8 stages of development can relate to substance use. Since your textbook kind of starts with childhood and adolescence, I feel like we're going to start there and talk about that for a minute. So in childhood and early adolescence, it is a time of rapid learning and skill development. So you're going through a lot of changes, you're learning a lot of things, and you're becoming a person. You're becoming who you are or who you want to be, I should say. Also during this time, it's important to note that your prefrontal cortex, which is taking your judgments, novelty seeking, and your self-awareness. It's taking those components. And it doesn't actually fully develop until you're 20 years old. So keeping that in mind, that in childhood, early adolescence, your brain is still developing. So when we add substances into this mix, it can really impair the development of the brain and developing those skills, such as, self-awareness and judgment. Just something to kind of take note of. The text does go on from here into a lot of talk about substance use in teens, also the different special risks for boys, special risks for girls. I'm not going to get too far into that, but that is part of the reading. You guys can read up on that. I do want to talk about the stages of change. This is going to sound very similar to the stage-wise treatment that we talked about earlier. So the stages of change, we have pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, and maintenance. So I'm going to explain those a little bit more for you and kind of give you an example of what an adolescent might say in these stages. So in the pre-contemplation stage, your goal is to build rapport with your client or your patient or the person in general. This time, that person is more than likely not going to be aware that they have an issue. They're not aware of, they're not aware that there's something wrong. They're not aware that there is a problem. So an example of what an adolescent might say in this stage would be, my parents can't tell me what to do. I use and I'm happy with it. I'm okay with it. I don't see an issue with my use. So that would be an example of what somebody would say in the pre-contemplation stage. The contemplation stage is where they're starting to think about their substance use, they might be aware that there is a problem, but they're not, fully on board with it yet. They're not ready to jump on the treatment train. But like I said, they're aware. There is an awareness there. So an example that an adolescent might say in this stage would be, I feel great when I'm high, but when I come down from my high, I don't feel so good anymore. So that's kind of an example of what a person might say if they were in that stage. If you're working in the preparation stage with a person, this is where they are actually preparing for change. So they might actually seek out treatment or, start initiating some of those phone calls or initiating those processes to get the ball rolling. If an adolescent was in this stage, they might say something along the lines of, I feel good about setting a quit date. So they're aware of it, they're focused on it, and they're setting that date. In the action stage, this is where you're actually doing a lot of your work. This is where you're making the changes, you're digging deep into what you need to do, you're setting your goals, you're making that change. So an adolescent in this stage might simply say, I'm making changes. I'm changing my life for the better. And then the last stage is maintenance. This is going to be your long-term recovery. This is going to be your relapse prevention. This is going to be, kind of like after you've already put in the work. An adolescent might say in this stage, I've been clean for 8 months. So, something exciting. They're proud of their abstinence and they're doing good and they're making those healthy changes and keeping up with it. So that is chapter 6. I'm sorry. A few more things on chapter 6. The book then goes through a little bit more of substance use through the life stages. So, middle adulthood and then, the older population as well. Something to take note of is that the baby boomers, their rate of increased substance use is actually doubles for any other age population. So I wanted to make sure that I pointed that out. And then, like I said, the last part of it discusses the older adults. So older adult populations who use substances, this can be very, very dangerous. The reason being that makes this population stand out or be a little bit more unique than other populations is because they have a higher death rate. Substances interact with medications, and a lot of older adults tend to be on more medications. So that drug interaction there already puts them in a different category that increases their chances of death. So I wanted to make sure I point that part out for you guys. Chapter 7. So moving on, we are talking a little bit about screening and assessment. So what is screening and assessment? What is the purpose of screening and assessment? So there are 3 things that are important to note about this: that it qualifies a client or a patient an appropriate problem. It means that there's something wrong and they're seeking out the treatment for it. It also, second thing is it allows the agency to get reimbursed for the treatment services. So at this point, they are going to provide a diagnosis, and this would be what allows them to get reimbursed for the treatment services. And then the last one, another reason or purpose for screening and assessment is to give the therapist information so that they can, carry on with treatment from there. 2 screening tools that you can read over on page 299 in your textbook are CAGE and TWEAK. Take a look at those, and these are screening tools that you can use, and they help kind of get information for you about substance use. Once we get a client or a patient into treatment, we are determining their level of care. So there are a few different types of levels of care. We start with early intervention. There's outpatient treatment, intensive outpatient treatment, partial hospitalization, inpatient treatment, and then medically managed treatment, or medically managed care. So those are the different types of levels of care, and you can read more about what each one is. The last thing to make note of in this chapter is we go back to that talk about the strengths perspective again. And I feel that the textbook will kind of keep referencing the strengths perspective as well as harm reduction model. The strengths perspective is you are building a relationship with your client. You want to identify their strengths. You want to see what's going on in their life, and you want to know what the client thinks would be different. Like, what do they want to make different for their life? This is total client control with strengths perspective. The client is in control, not the professional. So the client's deciding what is important to them to work on, and they are deciding what is important, goals for them. Your job as a professional or as a therapist might be to help them get to that process. You're going to help them build on those strengths once they've identified them, or help them identify them, and then kind of work towards what they want to be different. That's kind of strengths perspective in a nutshell with this. But we want to focus on a client's strengths and not their weaknesses, because strengths are what empowers our clients and what empowers them to make changes, not focusing on their weaknesses or focusing on their problems or focusing on things that can kind of set them behind on reaching their goals. So that is this module, and we will keep going. Thank you.